Hi, I'm Shane Lipson from Mount Franklin Insurance. A question that I get often from both homeowners and commercial building owners is whether their property is protected from water damage. And the question I always ask back is, well, what type of water damage? Because I categorize water in one of 4 different groups, and it depends what kind of water damage you have as to whether it's covered or not. The first broad group of water that I talk about is water that comes through the roof after there is damage to the roof, for example, from a hailstorm or a windstorm that rips some holes into the roof and allows water to seep in. Typically, that type of water is covered, and it's covered as part of the damage to the roof. Recognize, though, that usually there are higher deductibles for wind or hail damage to roof and resulting damage from water. And so you need to look at the deductibles, but in general, that type of grouping where water comes through the roof or a hole in the roof is covered. The second category of water damage typically involves spontaneous leaks from pipes or appliances. So think of this as the pipes that are running inside the walls, or a water heater or dishwasher or some type of commercial water application, where you get a spontaneous breaking of that and a leaking of water into the building or into the home. That type of water is typically covered in all risk policies, or what we call open peril policies or special policies, but not necessarily covered in very basic policies. And so as long as you have a broad-based policy that you've worked on with your insurance advisor, that typically is covered. And one thing I caution folks about, though, is that slow seepage of water from pipes, and particularly old pipes or old appliances, may be considered wear and tear by the carrier and might not be covered. And what is covered are spontaneous breaks in pipes or appliances, and I've seen that covered very often in those kinds of full feature policies. The third category that we talk about is water backup or sump pump backup. Some parts of the country know all about sump pumps, and some don't. Typically in places where you have basements and high water areas, sump pumps actually remove water from basement levels. But in either event, water backup or sump pump, what you're getting is a backflow of water through pipes that then infiltrates the home or the dwelling. It could be, for example, from a city sewer system that backs up and causes a backup into your home. And you can think about some challenging problems if, for example, a commode or toilet backs up, but it could be a sink or other kind of appliance as well. We have to also be careful because a backup is not necessarily the same thing as an overflow where you actually clog your own sink or drain. But regardless, that third category typically is not necessarily covered unless it's added by endorsement. And often if it is covered, there are sublimits of coverage that lower the total amount of coverage for that type of damage. So it's important that you look at your exposure for backup and sump pump if you have a sump pump, and make sure that you have sufficient coverage. The coverage is available, you just need to review your policy, make sure you've got sufficient limits. The fourth category is what we call flood. And this is probably the water that most people are familiar with, where you have a lot of rain or you have a levee or river overflow. You have some type of damage where water has first hit the ground and then seeps on the ground and infiltrates buildings and houses, and usually in a large community. Think of places that have hurricane-type rain, large rainstorms, or areas that are at the bottom of a valley where you have a lot of water flow down. No standard homeowners or commercial policy covers flood. If the water has hit the ground and then seeps into the building or dwelling, it typically is not covered by a standard policy. A flood-specific policy has to be purchased, and there are a couple of options for flood-specific policies. They're often offered through FEMA and resold through private insurance companies, but there also is private flood that's available. But in either event, typically these policies require something like a 30-day waiting period in order to put coverage in place, or have to be purchased in conjunction with a mortgage or loan on a piece of property that's purchased. But recognize that flood policies or flood coverage is not typically covered in your base homeowners or building policy. So when customers ask me about what type of water is covered and whether water damage is covered for their building or home, I always have to say, let's talk about the 4 categories, talk about which of these categories are concerning to you, and make sure that either the base policy or an additional policy is put in place. Come talk to us at Mount Franklin Insurance. We have water experts that can talk through the different types of water exposure and help you identify that you have the right coverage.